okay to talk among yourselves while the mic is off. In fact, you should. Okay. Otherwise, you look like wallpaper. We can't hear you until the mic is
Oh.
See, he's playing that now.
Oh, okay.
And he'll tell you when you're going to go on.
Okay.
And probably say something like, "You're on."
Now, go.
I don't have that headpiece, so.
We don't give the guests an earbud because there's no telephone calls.
Right.
If you had telephone calls or somebody outside speaking to you. If we're going to do a Skype call, we would give you.
Yeah.
Welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii. Today's show is Asia in Review. I'm your host, Ellise Akazawa. Today's guest is Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi, and our topic today is military modernization in East Asia, and that's a topic that you're very familiar with.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's military modernization is something that I've been looking at in my research, both in postgrad and also right now at the Pacific Forum CSIS.
So is this the topic that you wrote your dissertation on?
Well, actually, my PhD dissertation was on North Korea's military capability and its defense planning. So it's a little bit different and it's probably more specific, but military modernization overall is something I've been looking at for a long time.
And as Dr. Hinata-Yamaguchi mentioned, he is a VACI Fellow at Pacific Forum CSIS, where he has been for the past year, and you'll be leaving in just a few weeks, and this is actually your last Asian Review show.
Yeah, it's going to be really sad to leave, but you know, I guess my term is up, and yeah, hopefully I'll be working Pacific Forum in the years to come.
Absolutely, and Ryo was the first guest that I actually had on Asia in Review, and he's been the most frequent guest by far. I'm not counting, but this is either your fourth or fifth show.
Yeah, something like that. It's always been amazing, and you know, I always enjoy coming on the show.
So, well, thank you for always volunteering to come on and for being such a great guest. That's why I always invite you back.
Oh, thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about the overview of what military modernization entails before we actually jump right into the substance. So, military modernization,
right.
What exactly does that mean? Does that just mean acquiring new technology? Does that mean finding better uses for technology that militaries already have? What does that entail?
Yeah, well, military modernization it's essentially about improving military capabilities. And then you might ask, the next question will be, you know, what is military capability? Well, when many people ask me that question, you know, what does military capability mean? Is it all about firepower? Is it all about guns and ships and aircraft and things like that? I don't think it's that simple. And there's several stages to thinking about this problem. Is, you know, capability and capacity.
Okay.
Right. In general terms, what do you think is the difference between capability and capacity?
I actually don't know. That's a tough question. Way to turn it around.
Yeah, it is. Well, that's right. It is a tough question because, for me, capability seems to be more technical, and it's about, you know, what you do with the things that you already have, the existing, you know, hardware or whatever that you have in possession. Whereas capacity tends to be more economic, industrial. You know, does the country have the, you know, the finances to sort of advance, you know, whatever capabilities they have. So there's a bit of a slightly nuanced difference there. So there's two different ways to look at that, but you know, to sort of save time in debates, I tend to, you know, put together and say military capability is both about technology, political economics, you know, industry, procedures within the military about how you go about using technology, and other country specifics such as, you know, culture, you know, sometimes religion, and things like that. If we look at the technological side of the house, it's about balancing what we call force structure and operational preparedness.
Force structure, is that what it sounds like? Military capability,
it is.
The size of your arsenal?
It is, not just the size, but it's also about, you know, the nature of the arsenal, all the units, so aircraft, ships, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and of course missiles and nukes and things like that. They're the hardware. Whereas the operational preparedness It's more about maintenance. Yeah, a few procedures within the military about how to use these hardware. It's like, if you think about like a car, for instance, when you buy a car, that's an investment. The force structure of the car itself. Whereas things like registration, fuel, and other maintenance needs, that's the operational side.
I see.
So you need to balance that.
Okay.
It's a combination of that. You can't just have hardware and say, hey, look, country A has this kind of capability because they have this tank or whatever. That's not the way it goes. It's about, you have to think about the maintenance and the operational side of things when you look at military capability overall.
Okay. So, in terms of modernizing, who would be the standard for having the most modern military in the world? Is there a country that is the standard?
Well, it's hard to say standard because there's 192 plus countries. So it's hard to average out. Is there? Oh, this country probably has the most average military. That's going to be, that formula is just going to be huge. The most advanced military, however, is definitely the United States, both in terms of size and the quality of the platforms, and also the operational procedures and things like that. If we just look at the Asia Pacific, Japan, South Korea, and of course China is up there as well.
And Japan, China, and South Korea, do they have military industries that are building new defense systems and new weapons?
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the things that Japan. That's one of the things that's really standing out in Asia, is that the defense industries in each of these countries, have been involved a lot, and that involvement is increasing. For example, in Japan, you have the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Kawasaki Heavy Industries, and in Korea you have Hyundai, and many of the other major firms that are not only building, say, tanks or ships or aircraft, but also some parts like the computer parts and communications equipment and things like that.
So, do all militaries, and I guess it's really hard to say this with any degree of certainty, but would you say that it is a goal of many militaries to modernize?
It is. Well, again, if military modernization is about improving one's military capability, then obviously that's going to be one of the main objectives of that country. How they modernize it's a totally different question, because you see some countries that just focus on technological upgrades, that is looking for new generation of fighter jets or vessels, and even network systems, that is command and control systems and computerizing each of the units and things like that. But then you have countries like North Korea, or countries that are limited in economics and industrial capacity. Those countries will tend to sort of forge this innovation of the use of existing technologies. So using old technologies to sort of counter new technologies. For example, North Korea actually has stealth combat planes.
Okay.
Right? But it's different from the stealth combat planes that you have in the US. What it is that they've got a wooden aircraft and they just wrap it up with cloth. And therefore it doesn't go on the radar. That's one way. And another thing that they've done is they've got this Thunderbird style sort of runway where it's buried inside a mountain, and it opens up and fighter jets come flying out of it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so for them that's military modernization, because
so it's relative. It's a relative
it's
process
relative.
for each
It's
military.
relative, yeah. And it's sort of, I wouldn't say paradigms, but there's definitely two distinct ways in how countries modernize their militaries.
All right. So in terms of technical capabilities, we've seen technology really increase what's possible in everyday consumer life. So we have all kinds of fancy new phones and tablet computers and all things that we didn't have, or use readily even 10 years ago. Do we see that same kind of technology upgrade in the military? Are there advancements being made every day in terms of what's possible and what's capable, what's more efficient, what's more cost effective?
Definitely. Cost effectiveness, that's something that can be debatable, because the defense industry, the investments that go into the defense industry is just huge, right? And you can only measure effectiveness by actually using those equipment. So God forbid, if you can only see how effective a weapon is when they're actually used in combat or military exercises. if you're talking about sort of game-changing technologies,
Sure.
yeah, there's this concept called revolution in military affairs, RMA, and that is the advancement of technologies that changes the nature of warfare.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm following so far.
Yeah, yeah. So, for example, I mean, this concept goes back centuries and centuries and centuries, back to the 15th or the 14th century. First, you have the longbow, the bow and arrow that can fly further than the old ones. That was a game changer because that it changed how groups fought against each other. Then you had gunpowder, a few centuries later on, where people are actually using guns instead of bow and arrow.
Sure.
Yeah. And then you have the industrial age come along, so that changed like the production line and the various industries' capacity to manufacture weapons. Then into modern ages, you had the invention of the aircraft. Then the nuclear age, nuclear weapons, and now the information age, where the militaries are using are actually quite reliant on computer systems, not only for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, but also cyber warfare and electronic warfare, and also to communicate with each other. For example, like some soldiers actually have something that looks like iPads in their packs, so they can communicate with their HQ or headquarters, and also fellow soldiers in other parts of the battlefield.
So we really are seeing an evolution about what's possible in terms of military capability.
Definitely, and it's really important to know that it's not just about defeating the enemy, but it's also about communicating amongst ourselves. That's being one of the key advancements in military technology, in what you call command, control, communications, and computer. C4, and also intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And we call that C4ISR capabilities, where it's, I wouldn't say digitalized, but it's definitely enhancing the structure of the military in both wartime and peacetime.
Okay, very interesting. So let's jump over to the Asia Pacific. In terms of militaries there, we mentioned that China, South Korea, and Japan are the leading countries in terms of modernization. Right. Which countries are approaching? Which countries are really looking, aside from those three, to really modernize their militaries? What about Indonesia?
Indonesia is a tough one because they've got a huge military, but much of their technologies are quite behind. They're relying on technologies that were used in 1960s and things like that. So when you have a huge military and you want to upgrade, when you want to modernize the whole forces, you're going to have one group that's highly advanced and the other group that's not. And then there's the question about how do you maintain those capabilities, and how do you eventually streamline those capabilities across the board. So Indonesia, I think they face many challenges in that regard. In Southeast Asia, Singapore is definitely most advanced, and
it's not hard.
Yeah, it's not hard. Yeah, exactly. And they certainly have the most nuanced modernization program, simply because they have good industrial backing within that country, and that's a big factor, obviously.
What about the Philippines? I'm really interested in the Philippines because they've been getting kind of punchy with some of the incidents going on in the South China Sea. So what's their military status like?
Singapore's military status is, well, they face...
Philippines.
Philippines. Yeah, they face a myriad of challenges, obviously, because their air force is virtually pretty much non-existent in terms of combat capabilities. The Navy, they're pretty lightweight, so they can't challenge countries like China. They know that that's an issue that they have to tackle, but they don't know how because there are many organizational problems within their military, and also economic as well. So I think, along with Indonesia, in many ways, I think their problems are more chronic than Indonesia. They still have a long way to go, and that's something that we see in many of the ASEAN countries, where you see countries like Singapore and Malaysia quite high up, and then you have Indonesia, but then many of the other countries are sort of either falling behind or have simply not really, they simply don't feel the urgency to have an aggressive military modernization program. And an example of that is perhaps Brunei.
Brunei, okay.
Yeah.
I feel like we cannot have a discussion about military modernization and military in the Asia Pacific without talking about Australia. What can you tell me about Australia's military?
Yeah, Australia's military capability is actually one of the, it's definitely one of the strongest in the world. Not only because of the technologies that they have, but also because of the experience that they have. You know, Australia has fought along, you know, the United States and also the UK in many of the wars for past century and even more than a century, in fact. So they've got that experience on the battlefield, and that's definitely a plus. In terms of technology, they're actually very good at maintaining their units. The Australian Air Force had their F-111s, which is a very old airplane, you know, from, I think, dates back even to the 1960s, in fact. But they're very reliable, and Australians have maintained it very well, and it meets the Australian needs. That's actually one of the important things about military modernization, is that you've got to make sure that it
meets your needs?
Yeah, that it's capable of meeting the characteristics of your country.
Sure.
You know, Australia is a huge country compared to, say, you know, a country like Japan, which is a little bit smaller, or quite a lot smaller, and it's an archipelago. So it's got to meet that geographical conditions as well. And,
all right,
yeah.
So let's take a pause there. We'll take a short break, and we'll be right back with Asia in Review and Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi. Thanks. Okay, so microphones are off right now, so we'll just take like a 1 or 2 minute break.
We've never had that before.
No, we didn't, but now we're building the breaks in.
Oh, so how many breaks are there?
There will be 2 more after this.
Okay.
So, you know what I was thinking about? We'll jump into this next part right here on the key concerning trends, these new technologies, etc.
Right, cool.
But you know what I really want to talk about at
What's
the
that?
end, and I don't know if you're going to be that thrilled. I want to talk about, I guess, not the need for military modernization, but if we're trying to build like peaceful states, how does military modernization impact that? I mean, if we're modernizing militaries, if we're getting all this new technology, if we're having sort of like an arms race, especially among the countries in Northeast Asia.
Costa Rica? Like peaceful states?
I guess. Or like if we're trying to, you know, if we're trying to promote peace in Northeast Asia, or even the Asia Pacific generally,
So
how does military modernization impact that? Does it impact that?
Well, I guess you've got to get rid of the arms industry and things like that, and have less conflicts. But peaceful states, yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by peaceful states, though. I mean,
If you're trying to reduce the level of conflict in a region.
Oh, yeah, okay. Jeez. Seeing conflict.
So you realize that's kind of a curveball. But I think it's a really interesting aspect of it. Like if we talk about modernizing militaries and acquiring all this new technology, getting all these new weapons,
Yeah.
then does that mean that prospects for peace are dimmed?
Right. I guess we can put that just before arms control, and then you can, you know, pop that question up, and I'll be like, whoa, what about that?
Okay, well, we've
because
got
then,
like 1 second, so we're going to go back on, please. Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii. Today's show is Asia in Review, and we're talking about military modernization in East Asia with Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi. It's his last show with us on Asia in Review, and we're really glad to have him in studio. Just before the break, we were talking about Australia's role and its modernization in terms of its military. Now we're going to be talking a little bit more broadly about some of the key trends in the Asia Pacific regarding military modernization. So, Ryo, what are the trends?
right, there's several key concerning trends in Asia Pacific. One is amphibious capabilities, that is the capability to attack or go into an area from the sea.
Sure.
Or from offshore.
So are we seeing an increase in these amphibious
Definitely.
capabilities, and by who?
Mainly, okay, well, some countries like Japan, China, they're the 2 countries that are really sort of going forward with that. We also see that at a more modest level in the Southeast Asian countries, largely due to the disputes in the South China Sea. South Korea has already had that, but I guess that right now they're realigning that. They've got the technology, they've got the capabilities, they've got the tactics there, but they're trying to sort of realign that to the new age. North Korea, it was pretty much non-existent, but they've been using some hovercrafts and playing around with some of those technologies, so we might see some growth there in the coming years. Yeah.
So with, amphibious capabilities and with modernization overall, how do countries frame that politically? Because is it framed as we're just protecting ourselves and defending ourselves? Because I imagine that there might be some risk in terms of, for example, let's say Japan is increasing its amphibious capabilities. Certainly South Korea or China or other countries in Southeast Asia might perceive that as, oh, are they increasing these capabilities for a potential attack? How is this framed?
Oh, that's an excellent question, because no country's going to say we actually have these capabilities to attack you. They'll always say it's defensive. The key is whether they use the word recapture, conquer, or reclaim, whatever. It's like the wording.
Those seem like dangerous words to me.
Yeah, all of them sound controversial, and all of them sound as if they're overlapping each other. Japan, for instance, they're building their amphibious capabilities in terms of the defense of the Senkaku Islands, or in the Chinese name is Diaoyu Islands, in southwest of Japan.
And that's been a huge flashpoint over the past year, the Senkakus, Diaoyus, whatever you call it. Liancourt Rocks also, is that?
No, that's not really a defense issue right now, the Liancourt Rocks. Simply because Japan and South Korea don't see any sense in fighting each other for it. And for South Korea, it's not a disputed territory. I mean, they're like, okay, we've already occupied it, and Japan's like, okay, well, we do claim it, but they don't want to turn into a military issue. Whereas the Senkaku issue has always been like this defensive measure against Chinese incursions. Amphibious capabilities, why do we have it? It's largely a deterrence measure against China, saying we don't want your troops to land on the Senkaku Islands. If you do, we'll go in and defend that. And that's the message that we're trying to send, not only to China, but potentially North Korea, although I don't think North Korea is ever going to get to the Senkaku Islands, but also to non-state actors, that is, terrorists.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I think it's also important to note right here that despite your accent, you do hold a Japanese passport. So you're speaking from a Japanese citizen's perspective.
Yes, I even served my country, in fact, as a defense force personnel, so although everything's on my own opinion.
Of course, definitely in your own opinion, not the opinion of any government.
Right.
So for amphibious capabilities, I'm really interested in that because we hear a lot about it in the terms of HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So are some countries framing the increase in amphibious capabilities under that lens of, oh, we want to make sure that we have adequate HADR capacity?
Definitely.
And of course that, the intention of certainly may well be HADR, but I'm sure that there could also be another military purpose served as well.
Yeah, one of the important things that defense technologies or defense tactics or operations is that going in the latter half of the 20th century and definitely in the 21st century, the military operations have gone beyond simple combat and battles. It's also been about HADR, humanitarian aid and disaster relief. One good example of that was the 3/11 disaster in Japan, the earthquake and the tsunami and the problems going on in the Fukushima power plant. The amphibious capabilities became very useful, and amphibious capabilities of both the US and the Japanese forces to go in, from remote areas, going into the disaster zones to rescue civilians and other people that were either displaced or in trouble. So I think amphibious capabilities is not just about attacking or defending; it's also about civil defense, helping people out.
Okay. In the larger scope of the region, are there any other key concerning trends that we should be aware of?
Well, to quickly list them up, so we've already mentioned amphibious capabilities. Another one is power projection.
What's power projection?
Power projection is the ability to project one's power into an area that is distant from you.
Okay.
So, for example, missiles is a good example of power projection, where you're capable of attacking a country that is miles and miles and miles and miles and miles away. Other examples of power projection is aircraft, obviously, and heavy-duty vessels that can sail in seawater.
Okay.
Yeah, that's another example of that.
All right.
Yeah.
What about defense budgets in the region? So obviously in the United States, we're seeing some extremely constrained spending in terms of defense. What is the picture like in East Asia? Are they also facing similar budget cuts?
Yes and no. Some countries are facing budget cuts. Japan went through a bit of a dip in their defense budget for the last several years. Now it's gone back to early 2000s levels. Defense budget, though, it's hard. It's something that it's actually the hardest thing to measure when you look at a country's defense capacity, because the definition of defense budget varies state to state.
Okay.
Some countries will say, well, the R&D, research and development, is not a defense project.
I see.
Even if
so
it
the
is.
accounting matters. How you frame it really matters.
Definitely. And some countries won't include internal security as a defense measure, as part of the defense account. So whether countries increase or decrease, we can't get a definitive measure of that. We can see some general trends. For example, some countries like North Korea will always claim, we only use 15.8% of our national budget on defense, which is a lie. They actually use quite a lot more. But even if their figures are consistent, because their economy is going down, their economy is going through negative growth most of the time, obviously that means that defense budget is decreasing.
Declining as well.
Yeah, and it just doesn't sound right, if you look at the way the North Korean military has developed. So, yeah, determining if a country is increasing or decreasing defense budget, it takes a lot of calculations. You need new methodologies to understand that, and also the countries themselves might not have the right methodologies to do that either, whether it be intentional or unintentional. So it's a very, very concerning issue that countries don't have a mutual understanding of what defense budget means. And that is actually one of the concerning trends that I've seen in East Asia, especially in the last 20, 30 years, because of the economic growth.
As we talk about the economy, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about where these new technologies are coming from. In which countries are they originating? For example, we see South Korea, it's really well known for electronics. Does that mean that South Korea also has a thriving military or defense industry?
Yeah, definitely. South Korea and also Japan, and also Singapore to some extent.
Singapore?
Yeah, they're very innovative in their technologies. And of course, if the domestic industry in electronics, automobiles, robotics, and information technology is advancing, a lot of that is going to get devoted to the military. So that it sort of creates a way for them to ride on. Japan, as I said, Japan, South Korea are good examples of that. In Southeast Asia, South Korea, and China is a country that's sort of going through its exponential growth in that regard. So the domestic industry always counts, and that not only comes from economic capacity, but also education.
Education.
Yeah, that might sound weird, but for us, we're more accustomed to the latest technology than our parents or grandparents' generation.
Sure.
So you can say that we're more educated about technological issues and how to use them. So that gives defense modernization an extra sort of push to use, not only invent, but also use these new technologies that can be distributed to the whole, or even partially or fully throughout the militaries.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of this technology, are these countries exporting their know-how as well, their goods and their know-how?
Yeah. Defense exports tend to vary state to state. Some countries like Japan will actually have some laws saying we cannot export military technology to other countries, although there's been a revision of that in recent years to say, well, Japan can export or collaborate with other countries in that field. Defense exports is actually a very, very important part of the defense industry because it's one way to fund it. Yeah. You can either have your defense industry funded by the national government or through external funding, which is exports. So many countries, when they advance their technologies, they will want to export their technologies unless it's something that is very, very sensitive, such as stealth capabilities. The US was in many ways reluctant to export, for example, the F-22 Raptors, because they have the most advanced technology that they just simply do not want to share with other countries.
Understandable. All right. So we're going to take a short break right here. Stay with us because after the break, we're going to continue talking about military modernization in East Asia with Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi. Keep it locked here.
Wow, another break. Cool.
Ellise, always tell who you are.
Me too? Okay.
So I guess we could next talk about cyber.
Okay.
Slightly about cyber, although I'm not Miho, so we've already covered amphibious and power projection. And after we go through cyber and Cold War, after we go through cyber, I guess we can talk about. We just talked about indigenous defense industries, right? So we could continue with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, let's pick up on cyber.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting.
Cool. And then indigenous investment as to sort of summarize the trends, and then move on to. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, but
Yeah.
your call.
So then we'll have like another 15 or so minute segment, and then from there we'll have another break. And then for the last part of it, we can talk maybe a little bit about arms control, but I also really want to talk about, if we have all of this weaponization, if we have all of these increased capabilities, does that make, I guess, conflict avoidance that much more difficult? Because if you have all these new toys,
Yeah.
somebody's going to want to use them. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah. You might need to sort of, because it's a question I didn't really expect. Not your fault, not definitely your fault, but you might need to sort of egg me on a little.
Okay.
Yeah, like feed me a little so I can bite.
Okay.
Yum yum.
Okay. So we're going to be on again in about 5 seconds. Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Ellise Akazawa. My guest today is Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi, and we are talking about military modernization in East Asia. What does military modernization mean? What are the key concerning trends? And now we're going to be jumping into a discussion on cyber security and cyber warfare. So we've been talking a lot about acquiring new weapons technologies in terms of, I guess, what you might consider hard power. So amphibious capabilities, we're talking about acquiring new weapons. What about cyber? What role does that play, and are militaries looking to use that as a tool of warfare?
Yeah, so far our conversation has been looking at what we call kinetic technologies, the things that we use to really hit, to literally hit another actor or country.
Sure.
Yeah, cyber, there's 2 layers to that, in fact. You can look at cyber capability as in capabilities to use for cyber warfare, that is shutting down or slowing another country or another actor's network, or it's also capabilities where you can network your own military, unit to unit, whether that be vertical communication with your HQ or horizontal communication with your buddies on the battlefield. Just a 2-layered development there. Cyber capabilities is something that is growing trend and a concerning trend in East Asia, especially because of the Asian countries' advancement in knowledge-based technologies. One thing that has been highlighted of that is, for example, in South Korea from 2009, they've periodically experienced problems in their banking networks, some official websites, and even in airlines. Their networks have been disrupted from a source in either North Korea or in parts of China. And that is what makes cyber capabilities deadly, is that you don't necessarily know who that actor is. You might have some idea about where it came from, but you don't know about the specifics of, who actually did that. It could be the military, it could be it could be a hacker.
I feel that presents some really interesting challenges for governments, because you can always say that the attack was a private citizen, you as a government didn't sanction this wasn't your idea, and you can really hide behind that cover of this was a private attack, and I mean, who's to say? How would you know?
Exactly. And it's largely intentional as well. I'll be very surprised to see a country, at least in the foreseeable future, who will raise their hand and say, yeah, actually,
it was me.
It was me. I mean, it sort of defeats the purpose. One of the main advantages for a country that has cyber warfare capabilities is to make sure that it's stealth and that it's covert, and that you do it in the most effective way without people noticing, without people detecting, who you are or what you did or how you did it.
It almost seems that investing, I guess, in this sort of cyber attack capabilities would be a great cost-effective or less expensive way to modernize your military than, say, maybe acquiring new tanks or new guns, because the damage that you could potentially inflict on another country is huge. And I mean, I'm talking about going beyond banking or aircraft. I'm talking about knocking down security systems, knocking out power, because as we see all of these things, I guess, connected to some sort of grid, with that, convenience and with that modernization, that does present new risks.
Certainly. So far, traditionally we always think about warfare in three domains: air, land, and sea. But cyber is going to be the new domain. It's definitely going to be a new domain that countries will take advantage of, and that countries will definitely need to take need to understand. And the conceptualization of that cyber domain is really infinite. We tend to think, yes, we understand this much, but the next day it just advances that a little bit more. So we're sort of chasing after the trends that go on in that area. Another thing about cyber is that it can potentially be kinetic as well. For example, if you disrupt a network in a nuclear power plant, if you do it very well, that could potentially cause a meltdown of some sort, and that is definitely going to be kinetic, because it has physical impact on not only the environment but also the people around that area. So I think cyber is something that's going to expand in the future, and it's definitely something that we have to look into.
And I think it also, presents a real risk to civilians and civilian organizations as well, because, previously, at least my understanding is that you see states attacking other states. But in this new cyber realm, I mean, the potential for individuals to attack private corporations, or governments to attack private corporations or private citizens, all of that seems to sort of be on the table until we really get an idea of how to get a handle on this.
Yeah, so cybersecurity, again, it's definitely not a state-to-state thing. It could be a state to non-actor thing, non-state actor, or non-state actor to non-state actor. So there's the dynamics of that is very, very expansive, and as we said, it's invisible. One other thing about cyber is that it's very affordable as well. You mentioned earlier that it's a technology that is easier to access. So countries like North Korea, in fact, are getting into cyber capabilities, because why invest in tanks and planes that will cost millions, if not billions of dollars? Why not use that money to get some computer units that can do equal amount of damage?
So this is a huge oversimplification, but do you think that it might be possible in the future to really see the scaling down of acquiring of, I guess, more kinetic types of weapons, and instead more of a focus on cyber and other types of...
I don't think we're going to see a displacement. What I do see, it's hard to say the ratio, but what I do see is that both technologies being used in parallel to compensate or complement each other. Right now, I think kinetic technologies are still sort of the majority, but I think that balance is going to, I wouldn't say 50-50, but I'll say it's going to even out a little bit more in the years to come. And don't forget, we also have electronic capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities, such as magnetic pulse, which disrupts electronic networks or power, not in computer technology, but shutting down circuits and things like that. Yeah, so these kind of invisible technologies is definitely going to be one of the key trends or concerns that we'll see in military modernization.
Jumping to another topic now, one of the things that you had mentioned prior to the program is not the Cold War, but a Cold War. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
Right. The Cold War, we tend to think of the US versus the Soviet Union.
Sure.
It was a bilateral thing. It was very fixed for decades and decades and decades after the Second World War. Those days are over because the Soviet Union simply doesn't exist anymore. But we do see a Cold War where countries are competing with each other on a multilateral level. It's no longer about the US versus one other big rival, but you look at East Asia, you have Japan, China, South Korea, and some countries in Southeast Asia that are competing with each other in terms of technology, in terms of simple geopolitics. That's something that we could say is a potential Cold War Cold War of the New Age.
So with these geopolitical, with this new landscape, how does that impact military modernization?
It definitely lubricates military modernization in these countries. In Northeast Asia especially, you have rising nationalism, but more than that, you have territorial disputes, and you have resource disputes. All these disagreements and frictions will give the governments some kind of rationale to modernize the military, saying, hey, there's a lot of uncertainties about that country, so we need to modernize our military to defend ourselves. So I think that accelerates modernization of military technology amongst the countries that are in that mess.
And we really can't have a discussion about military modernization without talking about nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So how does military modernization and all of these geopolitical conflicts going on, how does that impact disarmament or prospects for nuclear disarmament in the region?
Nuclear weapons is not a region-wide trend right now. You have China that has nuclear warheads. You have North Korea that is developing those capabilities. And then in South Asia, obviously you have India and Pakistan. And then also in the US forces, if you count that into the region, in total you'll have 5 countries that have nuclear weapons technologies. How does military modernization fit with that? I think there's a bit of a gap, to be honest. Countries that modernize their militaries will say, well, these are defensive measures. Modernization of conventional forces, that is non-nuclear weapons, are for defense measures. Nuclear issues is a separate issue, and personally I agree with that, because nuclear weapons technology is something that is not shared mm-hmm. throughout the region. Japan doesn't have it, mm-hmm. And South Korea tried to, but it had a development program, but they pulled out. Mm-hmm. And there are some countries definitely do not. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a problem that is on a different level. The advancement in nuclear weapons technology, as a region-wide, as a region-wide problem, that really depends on the domestic politics of each of the countries and whether they want to cross that line.
And petition for nuclear.
Yeah, and that is going to cause all sorts of multilateral problems in terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and various other treaties that have made an effort to sort of counter that.
What are the prospects in South Korea for nuclear weapons? Is that something that they're looking to develop?
It's certainly something that they've been debating about extensively, and there's increasing support for the possession of nuclear weapons. But I don't think the government is going to. I don't think the government is really going to go ahead with that, at least for now. Not only because of the criticisms that they might receive in the international community,
sure,
but because that could kickstart an arms race throughout the region. Japan will go forward with that. We might see Taiwan jumping on board, and it's going to cause an ugly trend.
All right. We are going to take a very short break right here. We're going to pause. When we come back after the break, we'll be talking about diplomacy, about peace. What are the prospects for both in light of all of this military modernization that's happening in East Asia? Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Peaceful states. So, like, are you talking about like a multilateral peaceful like regime?
What I'm talking about is when you look at governments, look at all the people who have a vested interest in defense, in the defense industry. So you have a lot of companies who are pushing big systems, expensive systems, because they want to stay in business. How do you remedy that? The push for buying all this really expensive technology, having all this really expensive capabilities, if you're not going to use it, there are always going to be hawks,
right,
who are going to want to deploy. How do you balance that with?
Like, what alternatives to counterbalance that?
Or, like, pursuing like the diplomatic option. Is that going to be feasible when you have hawks in government? Or like, actually, we just have all this stuff. Why don't we just use it and show them what's up?
Yeah.
You see where I'm coming from? I feel like it gets into like this really weird sort of.
Yeah.
Because governments are not monolithic. They're comprised of people.
Yeah, definitely.
So, and people have egos.
Oh, yes.
And things that they want to prove. And if they have, this kind of technology at their disposal, does that mean that they're going to want to use it?
So it comes down to trust, really.
And then, so when you talk about this is, track 1.5 dialogues on how we understand modernization and how the technologies are used. Are you talking about, sitting down in these sort of like multilateral off-the-record forums where people say, yes, we have this, but this is how we're planning on using it?
It's more about, it's really an opportunity for countries to explain their stance on certain acquisitions and things like that. Because countries aren't going to be completely transparent, but you have all these misinterpretations about defense white papers and stuff like that. Is to get rid of, minimize it.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii. Today's show is Asia in Review. I'm your host, Ellise Akazawa. Our guest today, Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi. Ryo, thanks for joining us. We are coming up into the final minutes of our program. We've been talking about military modernization in East Asia. We've talked about defense capabilities, difference between capability and capacity. We've talked about prospects for nuclear disarmament in the region and how military modernization affects that. We're going to talk more now about diplomacy and about the prospects for peace. So throughout this entire program, one of the questions that I really wanted to ask you has been, if governments in East Asia, or even throughout the Asia Pacific, acquire all of these new capabilities, if they acquire the know-how to launch these really vicious, crippling cyber attacks, if they invest millions, if not billions of dollars in kinetic technologies that can really do all sorts of physical damages to other countries, how does that impact the prospects for peace? So for example, if a country has all of these, really modernized, really updated technologies, at some point isn't somebody going to want to use it? Someone in government, for example, with an agenda may say, hey, we've got all this at our disposal. I'm in a bad mood today. Let's go for it.
Well, that is certainly, if that is true, that's going to be a real concern. And unfortunately, it is true in some cases, as we've seen in history. However, in last few decades, or if not since the Cold War, the concept of deterrence has come up. where you possess certain technologies, say, all right, I have this technology, so don't do anything stupid with me. And that goes both ways. So if I'm country A and if I'm saying hey, this is to keep you at arm's length, the other country's going to do the same thing. So that in some ways there's sort of like a mutual understanding where you just don't want to mess with each other, and you need to have those technologies to prove that you can deter each other's capabilities and attacks, essentially.
But then if one country acquires something,
that is a little bit more. Yeah.
And then the other country is going to want to acquire something, and then it's like an arms race because don't mess with me because I've got this. Well, don't mess with me because I've got this.
Yeah, and that's the ugly cycle that we get into. It's like a spiral. It's like this action-reaction kind of thing.
Yeah.
That comes in, and a lot of that comes from misinterpretations and uncertainties. And it's particularly potent in East Asia, where you have countries conflicting with each other about not only about historical issues, but territorial disputes, and simply because they're just too close, they're physically close to each other. And it's geopolitics, essentially. As long as that exists, I think that, and as long as the mutual uncertainties and distrust exist, we're all going to have that. We're going to be in that psychological, sort of game. Where you say, well, okay, if that country's going to do that, well, we want that technology too, and that's certainly something that we need to find innovative ways to remedy or alleviate.
So you've got your PhD.
Mm-hmm.
How do we remedy strategic distrust and mistrust? How do we find ways to alleviate these concerns and build trust between countries that have, massive historical issues with each other, current issues with each other? How do we do that?
Well, if I
it's your last program. I'm going to ask you all the tough questions.
It is, I know. And if I need the answer to that, well, yeah, I'll be
you write a lot of
king of the Asia Pacific somehow. But just before I get into answering that, another thing that we have to understand is the domestic aspects. Again, we talked about defense industries, advancement of defense industries, and those defense industries will push the agenda for military modernization in many of the countries. So, and it's because they see bucks in that. So one thing that we need to do at the domestic level is to figure out, good or viable alternatives to keep these industries away from, pushing for military modernization. In terms of the international setting, I think disarmament of conventional weapons or military modernization is going to be close to impossible, simply because...
So repeat that last part again, I just want to make sure that I understood correctly.
Disarmament of modern conventional weapons,
okay.
So non-nuclear weapons.
Sure. So you think prospects for that are pretty dim?
Very, very dim, because many of the countries will say, hey, look, these fighter jets and these ships are for defensive purposes. Yeah.
What do you do if you decide you don't want it anymore? So, even if that were possible in terms of domestic and international political realities, what do you do when you're like, oh, I don't want this anymore? Do you sell it to someone else? I mean, that just seems a little bit concerning about where that might go.
Yeah.
Do you put it in the backyard somewhere, in some abandoned field, and that's the end of that? What happens?
Yeah, some countries have actually done that. Some countries starting with the letter N has sold off, half of their air force, saying we actually don't need to use these technologies anymore, so we'll get it away. But that country was not going to be a target of any other state in the area anyway, because they're in middle of the Asia, they're in middle of the Pacific Ocean. But for countries say like Japan, China, South Korea, North Korea, the ASEAN states, moving forward to that, it's going to be very difficult for them. I think one alternative we could think about is having some kind of dialogues, multilateral dialogues, whether at track 2, track 1.5, or ideally track 1 level, where they discuss about military modernization.
For people who aren't in the industry, can you just quickly explain what the difference between, say, track 1 and track 2 is?
Okay, track 2 is normally for experts and specialists that not in government, that are not necessarily in government. Track 1.5 is like a mixture, where you have mix of some people from the government and also from academic and think tanks and also industries come in and discussing certain issues. Track 1 is exclusively government. So there's 3 levels. And it would be ideal if we can have some kind of dialogue that addresses military modernization to promote greater transparency. If we can't have disarmament, or and if arms control is going to be controversial, then at least have a discussion on how capabilities are used and also the rationale for why countries are modernizing their militaries in certain ways.
So it's really just getting together and talking.
Yeah, getting together and talking, rather than having countries trying to guess that, hey, that country just released a defense white paper talking about this, but we're not sure if that's really true. Or
they admitted this.
Yeah.
What does this mean?
Yeah, at least give them an opportunity to explain themselves, even if it's a little bit bogus. Give them a chance to at least talk about where they're coming from on the issue about military modernization or military technology or operations and tactics.
So talking it's really the key, and that could really open up a lot of doors in terms of what could happen in the future.
Definitely, and I think and that's where uncertainty comes from, is that it's largely from miscommunication, misinterpretation, not only in terms of technology, but also what we call rules of engagement. That is the procedures for engaging in conflict. Knowing what that red line is for each country, I think that's going to help a lot.
Very good. Well, there you have it. The key is getting the parties to the table and having a discussion. Thank you so much, Ryo, for being here. Dr. Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi, he is a Vasey Fellow at Pacific Forum CSIS, at least for the next few weeks before he transitioned to nuclear opportunities in Japan and in Indonesia. Thanks so much for being with us today. I'm your host, Ellise Akazawa. We will be back again next week with another edition of Asia in Review. You can visit past episodes of this program as well as all of ThinkTech Hawaii's programming on our website at thinktechhawaii.com. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again next time.
Wenn ich der Fest, das ist also.